Right. So anyway, on Monday we were talking about ferrite, and perlite, and we just want to remind ourselves that perlite is a composite of ferrite and cementite in these lamellar structure, and the colonies grow out like a sphere, and that the main mechanism is this, what we would call the sympathetic sideways nucleation, where this regular wavelength is set up by the rate at which carbon diffuses in the austenite ahead of the growing perlite colony, right? And so if we're growing cementite, we're limited by the rate at which we can draw carbon in, because the cementite is a much higher carbon content than the surrounding austenite. And eventually we'll have a depleted zone in front of the growing cementite where it's low enough that will nucleate ferrite, right? And if we're growing ferrite, we have to reject carbon from as we grow. So we'll have a region of enhanced carbon concentration, and eventually that will build up to the point where we can nucleate cementite. And this sets off a regular wavelength, right? And that's the main idea, and that this perlite spacing is strongly temperature dependent because the diffusivity of carbon is strongly temperature dependent. It's a balance between the rate of growth versus the rate of carbon diffusion, right? And that and properties are going to be proportional to the perlite thickness. All right. And so I wanted to just talk a little bit about ferritic perlite steels, right? And this is a really huge portion of steels used in industry, right? Typically, these have a significant amount of manganese added, right? And the primary purpose of that is to tie up any sulfur that might be there. But manganese is also a very potent solid solution strengthener, right? Aluminum and silicon and magnesium are also deoxidizers. They tie up oxygen in the steel, and they're also grain refinement strengtheners, right? And so we're going to go through some heat treatments just a little bit here. We're going to have a whole lecture after bainite and then twinning and martensite on processing and alloying strategies for steels, right? So we will hit these topics again, but a couple key ideas here are normalizing heat treatments, right? We're going to heat the steel above the AC3 temperature to form austenite, and then air cooling slowly to room temperature through the transformation, right? And so this gives us a primary purposes of this are largely grain refinement and getting a fine perlite distribution, right? So normalizing heat treatments, we commonly do this during the production of steel plate, right? During hot rolling, the slow cooling that occurs from the rolling temperature results in these large grain sizes and coarse carbides, right? So that means the microstructure might be really difficult to heat treat following the hot roll. So we're going to put it through this normalizing heat treatment, right? Which means to sort of make the steel normal again. So we heat it above the AC3 temperature, but not too high. So we want to minimize the austenite grain growth while allowing these large coarse carbides to dissolve. Right? Then the steel is then air cooled to produce a fine grain microstructure with a fine carbide distribution. Right? And the idea here is we don't want to go too high up, right? Because then we'll get large austenite grains, and we won't be able, air cooling won't be sufficiently fast to keep a fine carbide, fine pearlitic structure. All right. So this is often done in a continuous furnace. So you have our steel strip is rapidly heated to the normalizing temperature. Right. You can imagine you've got a large, essentially roll of steel going down a conveyor belt with a passing through an oven, right? That's open on both ends. Right. So you're just constantly passing it through, and then it air cools on the other side. You can also use forced air cooling. Yeah.
Do you have to worry about like decarburization?
Yeah, I mean, in all of these, well, at this low temperature, not so much, right? But in all these processes, right, you got to. It's going to be dependent on the aspect ratio, right? If you've got a fine sheet, you have to worry about it much more than a strip steel, right? Yeah.
Why do we do gas cooling after normalization? Slow cooling because grain goes in, right? So after normalization, what cooling process is much slower.
But these are generally fairly thin cross sections, and you're not going too high above the austenization temperature, right? And if you cool it too quickly, you'll get martensite or other, right? So you need to be in the realm where you still get pearlite formation, and you want it to be in the realm of easy pearlite nucleation, right? So it's this kind of this balance, this magic. So you hot roll. So I'll talk about this more when we talk about processing, right? I'll show the actual plots, show the hot rolling temperature and the right. I'm likely to say something and then have to contradict myself in the future. So I'm going to defer that question slightly, right? Mostly because that lecture won't be until like after the fall break. I'm redoing the slides on that, and I haven't finished that yet. So it's not as fresh in my mind as other things, right? Okay, so annealing, we basically, a full anneal is we're going to a much higher temperature to dissolve all the carbides, and then we're going to cool through the austenite region to below the AE3 temperature, and this will give us complete transformation to ferrite and the idea of getting a coarse pearlite. So things that's gone through a full anneal is held at a very high temperature in the austenite phase field, right? And this slow cooling will give us a coarse pearlite microstructure that has very good machinability but fairly low strength, right? And if we cool slow enough, we can get only ferrite and pearlite. And you can imagine that this can be very time consuming, especially if you have large thicknesses, right? Cooling slowly for a big piece generally would mean a furnace cool, right? And you can imagine if you're doing, say, a 80,000 pound ingot, right? That cool could take several days. So sort of a compromise of this is sort of isothermal annealing, where you rapidly cool below the AE3 and then hold at a constant temperature, right, relative to the nose of your TTT curve here, right? So this is sort of the continuous cool. Here we come down quickly, and then we hold, and we can get this coarse pearlite structure, and then once we hold through here, we come down. Right. So it's much more efficient than full annealing, and we can also use it for batch annealing of large quantities of steel. Right. So you can have a whole furnace. Right. You can stack a whole bunch of stuff in there. It's more homogeneous than continuous cooling. Right. You get the complete section of your cross section of your part essentially sees the same temperature. Okay. So that's sort of the processing routes, and we'll bring these terms up, and we'll go through them in a little more depth in a later lecture. All right. But most of our commercial carbon steels are going to have other alloying elements. I mentioned manganese and aluminum and chromium on the other slides. Right. So plain carbon steels still contain around 1% manganese and are going to be a little less than 0.5% of silicon. These are often in there for production reasons, not necessarily microstructure regions. Right? And manganese is really super important, right? And it was the knowledge of adding manganese to plain carbon steels that allowed for the production of big cannons for World War I, the big rail-mounted and ship-mounted artillery guns. That without the manganese, before manganese steels were a thing, they had a tendency to have cannons that you could only use once or twice before the barrels ruptured on them. Low alloy steel is an important class, right? They have things like cobalt, chromium, molybdenum, and nickel, right? Generally, this is less than 8% by weight alloying additions, but the manganese concentration can be very high, as high as 5%. Right? Generally, these steels are still used in the austenite pearlite state, but we need to understand about how these alloying elements are going to influence the rates of these transformations. Right? So we're going to have a bunch of alloying elements that affect the kinetics of what we see to try and get out different microstructures. Right? So one of the biggest changes that the alloying elements could have is change the eutectoid temperature. Right? Nickel and manganese, right? FCC structures tend to make austenite more stable, right? And if we make austenite more stable, we're going to move the eutectoid temperature down, right? Okay. If we have silicon, chromium, and molybdenum, these are going to increase the eutectoid temperature by destabilizing the austenite, right, or stabilizing the ferrite. Right. So these can also change the rate at which the pearlite reaction occurs. Right. Almost anything that you add is going to retard the pearlite transformation rate. Right. Except cobalt. Right. Cobalt doesn't change it. Right. So basically, no matter what you do, you're going to slow down pearlite transformation. silicon, chromium, and manganese raise the eutectoid temperature. So the pearlite transformation tends to occur earlier at high temperatures in steels with these elements than it does in plain carbon steels. But at lower temperatures, the transformations in these alloy steels are going to be slower than in pure carbon steels, right? That's a balance between how much is available for growth versus how much the pearlite kinetics are retarded, right? So it's not necessarily a linear effect, right? Adding chromium, we move the nose of our TTT curve upwards and to the right, right? So we're going to be transforming at higher temperatures, but it's going to take a much longer time before growth starts. Manganese moves them in the opposite direction, right? And pure iron carbon eutectoid is going to fall between these two, right? And so you can see these alloying elements are going to greatly affect the lamellar spacing, right? So they're affecting both growth, and they can potentially also affect the diffusivity of carbon. So we're also going to see, since we're changing the lamellar spacing, we're going to be changing the strength of these in a fully ferritic pearlitic, or fully pearlitic microstructure. Okay. The other thing that we have to take into account is that these various elements have to partition between the ferrite and the cementite and the pearlite as a result as we grow. Right? They might be uniform in the austenite, but as we grow, we might have segregation of alloy from a uniform to being either rich in the ferrite or rich in the cementite. Right? So the cementite is not just going to be Fe3C, but some of the iron atoms are going to be replaced by atoms of the alloying element, right? And the ferrite, the amount of these alloying elements that are in the ferrite might be decreased relative to the austenite composition, right? I know this is kind of a bit of a word salad right now, right? You know, but I don't know of a better way of sort of throwing this out there other than just doing so. So what happens if these if elements partition, right? So, right, this is thermodynamically expected, right? So if we have partitioning is going to be favored by a low degree of supersaturation, or when the undercooling is small, right? The undercooling is small, we have more mobility because we're at a higher temperature. Alloying elements that have a strong affinity for carbon we call those carbide formers, and they're going to partition to the cementite, right? So manganese, chromium, and molybdenum are. I just realized I probably interchanged MB and MO frequently through the notes. Because when I took chemistry in high school, it was MB, probably because we had really old periodic tables. Right? So if you see that, you can just replace it with MO. On the other hand, silicon, nickel, and cobalt are going to segregate to the ferrite, right? So if we have a large degree of undercooling or a large amount of carbon, so that the higher carbon concentration, so that our supersaturation of the carbon is high, right, we can suppress this partitioning, right, if we cool it fast enough. Remember, it's much faster for carbon to diffuse than it is for these alloying elements, right? We need vacancies for this to happen, right? And of course, I just stuck my foot in my mouth, right? Because of course, it's not bulk diffusion, it's interface diffusion. Because we're, right? This is what I get for not reading ahead. It shows me the next slide. Right? Like I see both. But no, I have to open my mouth without thinking sometimes. Right? So growth is, the partitioning is going to be controlled by the diffusion of alloying elements along the interfaces, right? So faster than bulk diffusion, right? So and at lower temperatures where we don't have partition, our perlite growth rate is, of course, controlled by the volume diffusion of carbon atoms, like we said before, right? The pile up, or the depleted zone, right? So we might have a temperature that above which we have partitioning and below which we don't have partitioning, and this partition, no partition transition temperature is the characteristic of the composition of the alloy, right? And the more of the given alloying element that we have, the lower this transition temperature is going to be, right? The more you have, the greater the driving force it's going to be for it to partition. So you're going to have a lower temperature. Okay. And so we can look for, this is manganese, right? And so here we see this partitioning, what we call a partitioning parameter, right? It gives you the amount, the degree of partitioning is a function of temperature, and we can see that roughly below, this is Kelvin, so roughly below 670 C, we don't have any partitioning that's occurring. Manganese is found in the cementite and the ferrite at the same equilibrium concentration, but when we're above that, we get partitioning, right? And we can plot that with if we get the growth rate of the perlite here. Remember, we talked about the shape of this curve on Monday, and the effect on the lamellar spacing, right? So all of the temperature dependent effects in perlite growth are sort of in one sort of snapshot, the effect that manganese can have. Okay. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. Well, not necessarily that, but let's look at some of these compositions in a little bit more detail. So plain carbon, ferritic, pearlitic steels, we generally are going to have carbon concentrations less than 1%, and manganese concentrations about 1% for properties. And right, so our austenite grain sizes are about the same, but we can see here that if we add the effect of additional carbon on the strength versus the effect of additional manganese on the strength. So what is missing here is what the percent manganese is in this chart, right? But this is at constant manganese. So here we see the contribution to strength of the ferrite pearlite steel. This is the solid solution strengthening from the manganese. That's going to be constant. This is a austenite grain size effect, so that the effect of more carbon isn't going to change the austenite grain size. But we do have a strong increase in strength with additional carbon content, and this is due to the fact that as we add more carbon, we're going to have more pearlite, right? It'll be less ferrite, more pearlite, so our strength is going to increase, right? So manganese is a little more complicated, right? You can see we have manganese is a fairly potent solid solution strengthener. It has a small effect, on the grain size. It's going to have less of an effect on the pearlite colony size. Yeah. At the eutectoid composition, you're fully pearlitic. Yeah. So this is 0.05%. Right. Right. So this is 0.25%. So we're still well below the eutectoid composition. Right. And so grain size, aluminum, vanadium, titanium, and niobium. When we get to the processing, you'll see these come up again and again and again. These are very potent grain refiners, right? So aluminum forms fine aluminum nitride particles that are going to be found at the grain boundaries, and these are strong pinning particles, and they're going to restrict our grain growth, right? So aluminum is very commonly added as a grain refiner, right? So these are these ferritic pearlitic steels are typically used in what we call the hot finished condition, right? They have no other cold working or heat treatment, so they're very cheap. Keep the weight percent carbon low so that we don't have a lot of loss of ductility, and we primarily use these for structural applications: I-beams, buildings, ships, bridges, battleships. Right? These are the steels that we typically use them for. We can cold work these, roll them to get either a better surface finish. Is actually the primary reason why that's done. But a side effect of that is you get the increased strength because of the degree of cold working. So high quality sheet steel is done this. Sometimes it's given a subcritical annealing after the cold work to give us some recrystallization. And steels in this sort of state, we typically have a yield strengths of around 240 MPa with elongations of about 30%. So moderate strength, very nice ductility, exceptionally cheap to produce. Right? There's no exotic alloying elements here. Right? A little manganese, a little silicon, a little aluminum. Right? And this is the bulk of the structural steel that we use. And again, we'll talk more about alloying strategies and how to sort of develop an alloy when we talk about processing, right? How alloying and microstructure and processing all tie together in the end, because we, in general, for engineering applications, or at least interesting material science applications and interesting welding applications, we're not dealing with plain carbon steels, right? I want to think about advanced high-strain steels and more complicated microstructures and how do we optimize these.